Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about enemies. So I've already loaded up lesson 12 and changed the header to lesson 13 and enemies. I'm going to go ahead and save lesson 13. Okay, and from now on I'm just going to use Control S to save. The first thing I'm going to do is add a table that will hold my enemies, sort of like what we did for fruits. So enemies, and it's going to be an empty table. We're going to add the enemies one at a time. So you can have one enemy or multiple enemies, whatever you decide. Next, we're going to go down to our last function, to the end of our code, and we're going to write an add enemy function. And this enemy function is going to take some inputs. We're going to give it a costume. I'm going to call this my costume, just to keep it different from how we're going to do the actual enemy. My costume, my X, and my Y. I'm going to go ahead and end the function so I don't forget to do that later. So inside this function, I'm going to add an enemy object. And the way I'm going to do that is to declare a local variable. I'm just going to call it E for short. And it's going to be equal to a table. And this is going to seem really familiar, like when we added our blobby or player or our slime or object. Similar idea to that. Here we go, add enemy. Inside this enemy, very similar to what we've done before, I'm going to have a costume. And instead of giving it a number right now, I'm going to set it equal to this input of my costume. Let me just go ahead and copy and paste that, comma. And that'll allow us to build different types of enemies based on what costume we want. Okay, and then I'm going to need an X and a Y, and I actually need two sets of X's and Y's for this. This will come in handy later when we do motion. So I'm going to do a spawn point. So spawn X and spawn Y, and set them equal to my X and my Y. And then I'm going to do just X and Y and also set them equal to my X and my Y. So spawn X and spawn Y, I'm never going to change. That's going to be the starting point of my enemy. And then X and Y will be what I use to keep track of where the enemy is at any given point. And then the last thing that we need in there is active. And we're going to set the enemy to be active right away. So active equals true. Oops, need a comma up there. There we go. And then I need to add the enemy to the enemies table. Right now I'm just going to add one enemy. So I could do something as simple as enemies, that's my enemy table, bracket 1, that's just the first slot in the enemies table, equals E. So that's taking this whole table and saving it into my enemies table. So it's a table within a table. I'm actually going to do something a little bit different here because I want this to be flexible if I want to add more enemies over time. If I just do the number 1 here, I will keep saving over my previous enemy that I added, and I don't want to do that. So instead of a 1 here, I'm actually going to put hashtag enemies. And you might remember that that means the length of the enemies table. So I'm going to take basically the last slot in the table and I'm going to add 1. So that'll put my new enemy at the end of the table without overwriting any other enemy. Next, I want to draw the enemy. So I'm going to add another function, draw enemies. This one isn't going to take any inputs. I'll go ahead and end my draw enemies function. And inside this function, I'm going to loop through all the enemies in the enemy table and then draw them one at a time on the screen. I'm going to start with a for loop. And that for loop is going to loop from 1 to the end of the enemies table, which is going to be hashtag enemies. I want to draw each enemy. So to make my life easier in the long run, I'm going to make a couple local variables here. I'm going to do E for enemy, and that's going to be enemies, brackets, the current enemy that I'm looking at, and I'm using num to represent the slot that I'm looking at in the enemies table. That'll just save me retyping this enemy's num all the time. And then I'm going to make another local variable called C, and that's going to be my costume. So this will be E dot costume, and that'll pull the current enemy that I'm looking at and pull the costume value. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can draw the sprite. And remember, the sprite needs a costume, an X and a Y, and then I always put in 0 because 0 is my background color. So I don't know my costume number, but that's okay. It's going to be whatever costume my current enemy has. So that's going to be C, comma, and then I want to draw my enemy at its current X and Y values. So that'd be E dot X and E dot Y, and then 0 for the background color. Now I only want to draw this if it's active. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to do an if E dot active, then indent this. So this is the end of my if, and I still need to end my for. And then this one is the end of my function. Okay. So now I could draw an enemy if I added one to my code. So in order to actually add an enemy, I'm going to call this add enemy function in my initialize function. So I already have some fruits. I'm going to add enemy, and now I need to know which costume I want and where I want my enemy to be. So I have kind of a lot going on in my enemies area here. I have a few different enemy types. I have what they're going to potentially turn into once they're squashed. And then I might use this as an enemy projectile, so the enemies might be able to throw projectiles as well. But for now, I advise at least having one costume. If you have 2 costumes, that would be great, so they can be animated. A left and a right would be helpful. And if you want there to be something that happens when the enemy gets squashed, like maybe it turns over, maybe there's a little explosion, whatever, you can add a costume for that. All right, so my enemy that I'm going to use is going to be this cow. Its costume is 368. Let me comment this out real quick and run. I'm going to first save, Control S, and then run. So I want my enemy to kind of march around down here. So one thing you can do to calculate sort of where you want to be is to go into your map and multiply these numbers by 8. Because this is telling you the tile that you're at, and then each tile is worth 8. Somewhere in here is where I want to be. I decided on 20 and 103 for mine. So those are the 3 inputs in the add enemy function: my costume, my X, my Y. In my code, I've added the enemy, but I haven't actually drawn it yet. So let's go to our TIC function and think about when we want to draw our enemy. For now, let's do this. So draw enemies. Okay, let's save, Control S and Control R. So there's my enemy. So right now, the enemy doesn't do anything because I haven't updated my collision function to include the enemy. Let's add another enemy. So I'm going to go down to my initialize function, and I'm going to add another enemy. I'll just use the same costume, and then I want to put it up on a platform. So if I look in my map, my platform up here is going to be, somewhere in this area here. So somewhere between 32 and 72. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and put him way over here on the left. All right, so that would be about 32 and 24. All the updating and drawing should now happen automatically because in each of those functions, I am looking at all of the enemies. Control S to save and run. So I can see my two cows. I'm not going to worry too much about which way they're facing right now. When we add motion, we'll deal with that. So I'm going to leave my costume as just the first costume. If you know that you have an object that is not going to move, then just go ahead and draw the costume that you want that enemy to be. Now let's go ahead and add the ability for Blobby here to actually collide with the enemy and lose lives. So the little hearts in the upper right would go down based on how many times Blobby hits the enemy. So in my collision function, let me go ahead and hit this here. In lesson 11, when we were collecting objects, we updated this header here so that we had a player and an object collision. We can actually use that to check whether Blobby has hit an enemy by having the object be the enemy. So Blobby will be the player and the enemy will be the object. Let's go down to the bottom of our code. And now we're going to do a function that is called hit enemy. Here's the end of hit enemy. In this function, we're going to check whether Blobby has hit any of the enemies. So we're going to do a for loop, same as before, to look from the first to the last slot in the enemies table. And then we want to, inside this table, like we did before, we're going to do a local variable that will hold the current enemy that we're looking at. So that would be enemies, bracket, num, bracket. And then for each of those enemies, I want to check if there's a collision. And I'm going to use a variable I'm going to call hit to keep track of whether that enemy has been hit by Blobby or whether they hit each other. And that hit variable is going to come from my collision function. So remember, my collision function actually returns true or false based on whether there's been a collision. And the collision function takes the x and y of Blobby and the x and y of whatever I'm colliding with. So this will be e.x and e.y. So this collision function is going to check each of the enemies one at a time to see if that enemy has collided with Blobby. If it has, hit will be true. Okay. So then if there was a hit, so you could do if hit equals true, or you could just do if hit, that would be the same thing. So if there has been a hit, then I want to take one life away from Blobby. So that would be blobby.lives, I believe. Let me just double check. Yep, so blobby.lives equals blobby.lives minus 1. So we'll take one life away. So this is the end of my if, and I also need to end my for. And then I need to call the hit enemy function, and I need to do that in my TIC function. So as the code runs and runs, we are checking whether there has been a hit. So somewhere in here, I'm going to want to add my hit enemy function. So I'll just add it at the end here. All right, Control S, and let's run it. So now you notice that when I hit the cow, I just immediately lost all my lives. So in order to avoid this, I'm going to reset Blobby back to his kind of spawn point. So immediately when he hits the enemy, he respawns back over here and has to start from his starting point again. All right, so let's take a look at that. So in hit enemy, if there was a hit, then we take a life away from Blobby and immediately set blobby.x to be the original x and blobby.y to be the original y, which I'm going to have to look up. So let's look up here. So I just spent some confusing minutes trying to figure out why, if I have Blobby at 0, 0, why is he over here? And I realized that if I put him at 0, because of my check limits code, he's going to pop over to the other side, and then he falls down to the bottom. I should probably just update that. So I'm going to try, say 230, almost to the right of the screen, but not quite. Let me look at my map. Something like 13 times 8-ish. So maybe I'll put him just a little bit above that. Maybe about 103, like what the enemy was. And then down in my hit enemy, let's go ahead and update this with our spawn point of 230 and 103. So it should reset Blobby back to the spawn point when he hits the enemy. Control S, Control R. Let's try it out. There we go. So I can keep, I can go ahead and keep hitting him. And now I can't lose any more lives. Probably if I was printing out my variable, it would be negative right now. But eventually I'm going to say once the lives hit 0, something will happen. All right. So now let's think about if we want to squash this enemy. I want to be able to lose a life if I hit the enemy from the sides, but have the enemy get deactivated if I hit it from the top. So let's make some modifications to the collision function. So we have our hit X and hit Y indicating if there's been a collision in the horizontal direction or the vertical direction, but we need to be a little bit more specific. So I'm going to divide this into another section. So we have if we've been hit at all, then we want to return true. For that one, I actually want to do return hit and make another if and make this an else if. Because I want to catch the most specific version of the hit first. So that would be a top hit. And then if it wasn't a top hit, it's any other kind of hit. And then if it wasn't a hit at all, then I'll return false. Okay, so in the if, we want if hit X, like if it was hit in the X direction and hit in the Y direction, and we want the player's Y value to be above the object's Y value. So the player has to be above the object falling down on top of it. So because we're kind of upside down with 0 on the top and a bigger number on the bottom, that would mean our player Y would be less than our object Y. Then what we want to do is return top hit. So what's nice about Lua, the language that we're using in TIC-80, is that any string is looked at as a value of true. So everything that we've used true for in our code will still work, even though we're not returning true specifically. The string is interpreted as a value of true. And then we can use this, was it a top hit or a hit, to be more specific when we need it. But otherwise, we can just act like it's returning true here and returning true here. So now if we go into our hit enemy function, we can change it so that we're doing something specific, whether it was a hit or a top hit. So instead of just saying if hit, we're going to say if hit is equal to top hit, then we'll do something. And if hit is equal to hit, then we'll do something else. Else if the collision, the returned collision value is just a regular hit, then we want to subtract 1 from Blobby's life. So that was a side hit. Blobby just ran into the enemy. So we want to take away a life from Blobby and reset Blobby back to the spawn point. If hit was a top hit, then we want to make the enemy not active. So it would be e.active equals false. Okay, and I didn't add another if in here. I just added another section to this whole if part, so I don't need an extra end in here. Okay, so then when we're drawing the enemy, we need to decide what happens when he deactivates. So let's go into draw enemies. And right now we're just drawing it if it's active. If you want it just to disappear, leave the code like this. If you want it to do something else when it's active, when it deactivates, like do some kind of animation or change costume, that kind of thing, then put in an else, and in that else, say what it's going to do. So for me, I'm going to do this same thing, except instead of the costume, I'm going to do the costume plus a certain amount to get me my deactivated costume. So notice how I've lined everything up the same every time. So if I have a starting number, it's always going to be the same offset to get the projectile or the deactivated state or whatever. So here I'm at 368. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spots later is this. So 368 plus 5 would give me 373. So in my code, I can just do C plus 5, and that will give me that next costume. All right, let's try that. So Control S, Control R. So I should still lose a life if I touch the cow, so that works. And now if I jump, I definitely am registering a top hit, but I'm still losing a life. So let's go back into the code. So here where we're saying if we get a hit, we only want to register a hit if the enemy is still active. So if the enemy has been deactivated, we don't want to register a hit anymore. So we're going to say and e dot active, and same down here, and e dot active. All right, Control S, Control R. So I still lose a life when I hit the cow, and then if I jump, now I can go on top of that and it doesn't do anything. So in another video, I might add projectiles so that I could maybe collect that hamburger, and maybe that would be kind of like a power-up or something. I might add something like that. In the next few videos, I'm going to talk about making the enemy move. So there could be a march back and forth kind of action, or a fall from the sky kind of action, or an AI sort of follow the player kind of action. So we'll see you then.